This is the second video that's going to go along with your blue book and review some of the math concepts that you're going to need to know for the PSAT. One of the point that I wanted to point out was that there will be no complex numbers, logs, or trig on the SAT math, which is kind of interesting because those are some high-level topics. So you can kind of expect, the test isn't going to be easy by any means, but you don't have to worry about logs, you don't have to worry about trig, and things of that nature, okay? You could look at this. It goes through operations on algebraic expressions, combining like terms. Factoring is huge, difference of two squares, finding common factors, factoring quadratic. All that stuff's important. Exponents, definitions, three things to remember I thought were interesting. When you multiply two exponents of the same base, as you see here, that you add the powers. And obviously it's like a to the second times a to the fifth is like 2a's times 5a's, which makes 7a's. So it kind of makes sense where you add the powers. And then it kind of applies to dividing powers, where you can cancel out everything in this case and get r squared. And then when you want to do power to a power, as you see down here, n to the third to the sixth is like n to the third times 6 times, which is n to the 18th, or here's the property that you see. So quick recap of properties of exponents is always worth a minute. Evaluating exponents and exponential roots, one of the things you got to recognize that you maybe forgot or haven't seen in a little while is the idea that a fraction power, if you could look right here, a fraction power can become a root. So y to the 2/3 is like the bottom number is the root, in this case cube root, and the top number is the power. So y to the 2/3 is the cube root of y squared. If you have 8 as y, this is what you would do. So that's going to be another thing that you got to watch out for and maybe haven't seen in a while. And just as you go through this, if you see something that I'm not really emphasizing, take your time, pause the video, and read it again, because honestly, everything in here is valuable and is a good reminder. Working with unsolvable equations, 2 times a plus b, stuff like that. Solving for one variable in terms of another. When you do this, typically you're not going to have many numbers. You just got to solve for a variable. So what is x in terms of y and z? You just get x by itself. The example over here, where basically you just get x by itself by subtracting y and then dividing by 3. And I'm talking about what's right here. So just different things to look out for, okay? Another thing, I had this pointing at this box. And these boxes, as you read through, are going to be giving you nice little tips. Keep in mind. So in this case, when I square root a number, that I could get positive or negative for the answer. So if x squared equals 25, for instance, the answer is 5 or negative 5. So that's something to think about as well. Another thing you want to look at is direct translation into mathematical expressions. 3 times the quantity, 4x plus 6 translates to that. So if you can zoom in on this right here, you can kind of see some of these little tips. It's good to read through these. I could read through them with you, but you could pause the video and read through them yourself. Inequalities are important to understand. Greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. Obviously, we know what these things mean. It's always good to review, which direction things go. Again, here's another interesting thing to keep in mind. Keep in mind that when multiplying, dividing both sides of an inequality by a negative, that you flip the sign. So that's going to be the only thing really that's different between inequalities and equations is when dividing by a negative, you flip the sign. And again, just running through this whole worksheet, this blue book, you see a lot of interesting things. Systems of linear equations. You solve by substitution elimination. You could look at the different ways you can do this. Solving quadratic equations by factoring, rational expressions and inequalities. When looking at this problem, solving something like this is always good to look at. You multiply both sides by the denominator, which will end up giving you this. So different little tips. It's good to refresh on just looking at this. Direct and inverse variation is one of those topics that gets a little bit of play in Algebra 2, and then you forget about it. But direct variation basically says if two things are directly proportional or indirect variation, that they are so if it says because x and y are directly proportional, then y equals kx, and that would be what you'd say for that. That's direct variation. Inverse variation, if you could see this up here, inverse variation, if two things are inversely proportional or inversely variant, then that would mean y equals k over x. So if y and x are inversely proportional, that would be y equals k over x, and then you could figure that out from there. Again, good things to review. Is it going to be necessarily 100 questions about inverse and direct variation? No, but if you see 1, now you kind of hopefully remember what to do. Word problems, some tips for that. Translating what you read through that. Here's a nice table that you might want to look at that kind of walks you through different words and what they mean. This is a great review. I mean, I could read it to you, but it'd be more beneficial if you read it and mark in your book yourself and see these things. But definitely some good things to look at on this page. And then you start to get into examples of these things. Examples that go through these, certain things you can read these examples, look at these. I'm not necessarily going to do these, but you can read through any of these. Here's an inverse variation or inverse proportion question. You might want to check that out because that's something definitely that you don't talk about in much depth in Algebra 2, but you do talk. All right, and then it picks up back here with functions. Okay, functions are input-output relationships. Okay, and functions typically you start talking about domain and range. Domain is a set of all values for which a function is defined. The range is a set of all values that are outputs or results of parts of the domain. And then it gives you an example to find the domain and range and things like that. So reviewing domain and range is definitely something that you want to do. Domain, obviously, x values, inputs, defined values, and then range are all the outputs. Using new definitions. This is one of the things that the SAT likes to do a lot. Typically, the SAT or PSAT will do something like give you something like let this box with x, y, and z equal wy, or w, x, y, and z equal wy minus xz. So basically, you got to use this idea here to solve a problem, even though this is like nothing that we've ever done. So they're going to define something in a unique way. And again, the SAT is just trying to see how well you can think through problems. So it says w, x, y, z in integers. So like, what's the value of 2, 3, 4, 1? Well, if it's wy, if I'm doing this, wy, it's going to be 2, 1, 2 times 1 minus xz, so it's going to be minus 12. So I would expect the value of this to be 2 minus 12, which in this case ends up being negative 10, which, and again, that's something that the SAT does a lot. It'll define something in a very strange way and ask you to solve a problem using that. Functions as model, do that. Linear functions, how to graph, y equals mx plus b, b is, all these things. Good review, good things to look back at. Fresh your memory on. Here's an example. Qualitative behavior and graphs of functions. Grading is definitely something that the SAT will test you on. Translations and their effects. I actually posted a video about translations that you guys can watch, and it kind of walks through all the different ways a graph can change based upon adding, subtracting something inside, outside, putting a negative in front, all those kind of things that change. So again, hopefully this is helpful, and as you go, stop and pause and look at anything you want to. Take as much time as you need.